The dungeon wasn't just a room. Beneath the creaking floorboards of medieval castles and city halls, there was often a deeper silence, a silence wrapped in damp stone, iron hinges, and forgotten air. The dungeon, that dark word so synonymous with cruelty, wasn't always a sprawling underground complex lined with chained prisoners. Sometimes it was a single, windowless chamber carved beneath a chapel. Other times it was cleverly hidden within the very walls of a royal court. These spaces were not accidents of architecture, they were designed. Thick walls muffled screams, drainage channels managed the unmentionable. Slanted floors helped with cleanup. There was logic behind every stone, a cold efficiency in their stillness. By the 13th century, especially in places like the Tower of London or Castel Sant'Angelo in Rome, dungeons became not just places to store prisoners, but tools in themselves, stages for fear, calibrated to silence both the body and the spirit. Here, the walls didn't just contain, they conspired. Guards knew how to open trapdoors to rooms without exits. Architects embedded stone rings into masonry for convenient restraint, and in the German-speaking world, oubliettes, vertical pits accessed only from above, were designed not for torture, but for forgetting. A prisoner dropped in might be left in darkness for days, or never lifted out again. These rooms were versatile. A space used for confession on Monday might serve interrogation on Tuesday. And unlike today's sterile notions of incarceration, medieval justice was often a matter of days, not months. The dungeon wasn't just the end of the process, it was part of the process. Mainstream historians often point to the Papal States' growing bureaucracy in the 14th century as a time when dungeon design became standardized. Yet even earlier, documents from 12th century France describe royal engineers building that they called auditory vaults, rooms specifically shaped to carry sound only inward, never out. And then there's the fringe theory some scholars still debate, the claim that some dungeons were built to amplify screams subtly, a psychological tactic to terrorize new prisoners or onlookers. Whether acoustics were truly weaponized this way is still up for debate, but the rumors alone gave stone rooms a kind of sentience. We tend to picture the dungeon as a place of blood, but more often it was a place of silence. The real horror wasn't the chain or the branding iron, it was how the room itself seemed to wait. In the medieval world, confinement wasn't just physical, it was atmospheric. The door might close behind you, but it was the walls that did the rest. The rack didn't just stretch, it spoke. If there's one device that has become the symbol of medieval torture in the modern imagination, it's the rack. A long wooden frame, rollers at either end, and the slow turning of a crank that pulled a prisoner's limbs in opposite directions. But the rack wasn't just about physical pain, it was a performance, a methodical, measured destruction that broke more than bones. It unravelled identity. By the late 1200s, the rack had become a fixture in many judicial torture chambers across England and continental Europe. The Tower of London had one of the most infamous examples, nicknamed the Duke of Exeter's Daughter, used during the reign of Henry IV and beyond. It was said that her creaking voice could be heard in the silence between interrogations, wood bending under stress, mimicking the groans of those strapped to it. Of course, that was just folklore, but for the prisoners who heard it before their turn, it was as loud as thunder. The real design of the rack was disturbingly simple. Ropes fastened to wrists and ankles, tightened by cranks at either end. Each turn pulled the body incrementally farther than it was ever meant to go. Muscles tore, joints dislocated, tendons snapped. Some victims described the sensation as if their soul was being pulled apart. But in most recorded uses, the goal wasn't death, it was confession. Or, more precisely, narrative control. Officials wanted a story, and the rack could extract one. Mainstream accounts from the Inquisition and English trials describe prisoners confessing to crimes they may not have committed, witchcraft, heresy, treason, after just a few turns. Sir Thomas More, martyred in 1535, spoke out against the rack before his own execution, noting that truth forced from the body meant nothing in the soul. His observation, still quoted by legal scholars today, cut to the heart of medieval just ice. Was truth something one said freely, or something one could be pressed into saying? Even stranger are the rare testimonies of those who survived multiple rack sessions. A Flemish rebel named Jacob van den Einde, stretched and interrogated in 1568, later claimed that the pain was so intense it severed his memory from reality. "I do not know if I said what they wanted or what I dreamed," he wrote. And yet, scholars still debate whether the rack's primary function was pain or spectacle. Was it meant to break the body or to be seen breaking it? Some records suggest that in certain cities, dungeons were built with viewing slits, allowing judges or clerics to witness the exact moment of surrender. The turning of the crank wasn't always about muscle, it was about message. There's something almost theatrical about it all, the slow, visible torment, the careful recording of confession, the implication that truth could be wound out of a man. It wasn't just about punishment, it was about choreography. And in that cruel dance the rack had a voice of its own, iron maidens and the problem of myth. Among all the implements associated with medieval cruelty, the Iron Maiden looms largest in the public imagination. A standing coffin, its interior lined with long, gleaming metal spikes, waiting to impale anyone locked inside. It's a terrifying image, neat, final, and nightmarishly clean. But here's the unsettling truth. It probably never existed in the Middle Ages. At least, not like we think. The Iron Maiden is a classic case of historical layering, where real fear, exaggerated storytelling, and 19th century showmanship blurred into something more potent than fact. The earliest physical examples of Iron Maidens don't appear until the 18th century, often in museums or sideshows rather than court records. The most famous, the so-called Iron Maiden of Nuremberg, was likely assembled in the early 1800s, using older iron fragments and modern imagination. It wasn't built to torture, it was built to shock visitors. That doesn't mean the idea was pulled from thin air. Medieval Europe did have enclosed torture devices, coffins, cages, and heretics' forks, used to hold victims upright in agonizing stillness. There were upright sarcophagi used for restraint, and some contained sharp edges or hot metal surfaces. But the sleek, spiked maiden we picture today, she was born centuries after the Inquisition ended. Still, that hasn't stopped the Iron Maiden from becoming one of the most enduring symbols of medieval cruelty. Tourists flock to see them. Films and novels breathe her name with reverence, and in a strange twist, the Iron Maiden's myth has shaped how we remember the era itself, brutal, merciless, and surgical in its violence. Mainstream historians now agree that the Iron Maiden is a modern fabrication, but some fringe scholars argue that descriptions of similar devices might exist in early Arabic or Byzantine texts, references to enclose, sing chambers of nails, or boxes of death used by tyrants. Whether these were metaphor, mistranslation, or the real seed of the myth remains open to interpretation. Even more curious is how easily the myth has replaced reality. Real torture in the Middle Ages was rarely so elegant. It was messy, personal, improvised. Red-hot tongs, thumbscrews, water torture, all lacked the theatrical neatness of the Iron Maiden, but they were real and used widely. So why do we cling to her? Perhaps because she looks like a machine, something beyond the human hand, a cold automation of cruelty. In an age where most suffering was intimate and improvisational, the Maiden represents something scarier, the systemization of pain. Scholars still debate whether the popularity of Iron Maiden displays in the 1800s shaped our modern revulsion of medieval justice, or simply confirmed it. Either way, the damage is done. We remember what could have been, even if it never truly was. In the end, the Iron Maiden is a lie that tells a truth. Even if her spikes were forged for display, not punishment, they tap into something deeply medieval, the fear that the system wasn't just cruel, but clever. Torture as spectacle, public pain for private power. It's easy to imagine torture as something hidden, done in shadowed basements, far from the public eye. But in much of medieval Europe, that wasn't always the case. Pain wasn't just a punishment, it was a performance. In town squares and market streets, across bridges and outside cathedrals, the tools of suffering were often brought out into daylight, not to punish a criminal, but to remind the crowd who held the power. From the 12th to the 16th century, Europe witnessed an evolving culture of public torture and execution. It was theatre with a very clear message. This is what happens when you defy the order. In cities like Paris, Florence and Prague, platforms were built not only to elevate the prisoner, but the lesson. Iron collars, whipping posts, stocks, and even rotating wheels of punishment were all displayed in open view. Some executions were accompanied by drummers, church bells, or heralds reading the charges aloud, turning agony into orchestration. One of the most well-documented examples was in 15th century France, during the execution of François Villon's accomplices. A small scaffold was erected at dawn, and the condemned were paraded through the town. Each was flogged, branded, or broken, depending on their crime. But the real focus wasn't on the body, it was on the ritual, the symbolism, the sequence, pain as a form of civic punctuation. And the devices themselves played a role in this drama. The breaking wheel, for instance, was a massive wooden cartwheel used to smash limbs and stretch a person over its rim. Victims were tied across the spokes, and bones shattered methodically with iron bars. Yet the true spectacle wasn't in the breaking, it was in the waiting. Victims sometimes lived for days, publicly displayed while their bodies crumpled like fabric. Townspeople walked by, paused, and looked. Mainstra. Legal scholars of the time often defended these acts as preventative justice. The idea was simple. If people see what happens to a thief, heretic, or traitor, they'll be less likely to become one. But we know from contemporary letters and journals that reactions varied. Some viewers were horrified, others amused. Children were sometimes brought to watch, as if to inoculate them against disobedience. And not all torture was fatal. Punishments like the strappado, where a prisoner was hoisted by the wrists and dropped to dislocate the shoulders, were often done in front of an audience, then followed by exile or public penance. The goal wasn't death, it was humiliation. The public didn't need to see blood to understand obedience. They just had to see a man scream. Scholars still debate whether these spectacles genuinely deterred crime or simply normalized cruelty. Did they instill fear or numbness? By the late 1500s, Protestant and Catholic cities alike began to phase out the more gruesome methods, often citing a loss of dignity among the watching crowd. But the memory of those performances lingers. We may no longer gather in town squares to watch bones break, but the logic of spectacle remains. A punishment, made visible, speaks louder than any law. In medieval Europe, torture wasn't just about pain, it was about power made visible, and suffering turned into script, inquisitions, and the machinery of belief. If torture in the public square was about power, then torture behind cathedral walls was about faith, or more precisely, control over it. In the hands of the medieval church, pain became theology. From the late 12th century onward, inquisitions across Europe, most famously the Spanish Inquisition, developed a system of interrogation where salvation, heresy, and suffering were intimately linked. The medieval Inquisition began formally around 1231 under Pope Gregory IX, who authorized the Dominican order to root out heresy. What followed wasn't a single unified campaign, but a sprawling, evolving bureaucracy that operated in waves across France, Italy, Spain, and beyond. With it came a quiet revolution, the creation of procedural torture. Inquisitors didn't simply accuse and burn, they recorded, questioned, catalogued. Trials were conducted in Latin, witnesses were kept secret, accused heretics were denied legal representation, and when confessions didn't come voluntarily, the tools came out. One of the most frequently used methods was the strappado mentioned earlier, arms tied behind the back, the accused hoisted by a rope and dropped suddenly to jerk the shoulders out of their sockets. Unlike the rack or wheel, the strappado left no external marks, perfect for an institution that still claimed to save souls, not merely punish bodies. The idea was that pain, if administered correctly, could lead to truth and repentance. A confession wasn't just an end, it was a restoration. Mainstream church records from the 14th century show the process in chilling detail. Inquisitors kept logs of each session, noting the accused's reactions, denials, and eventual submission. One account from Toulouse describes a woman, suspected of Cathar sympathies, who withstood 3 rounds of interrogation before finally speaking the truth of Christ. But what truth meant in such conditions remains impossible to define. The Spanish Inquisition, formally established in 1478 under Ferdinand and Isabella, expanded this system further. In their courts, confessions were carefully engineered. Torture was permitted by law but limited by timing, no more than 15 minutes per session, unless extended by necessity. This cold logic created what some scholars now call the machinery of belief, a system in which pain and redemption were measured in equal parts. Fringe accounts suggest even more elaborate tools. Water torture, where victims were forced to swallow cloth strips soaked in vinegar, or confinement chambers that simulated burial alive. Some of these are poorly documented, others mentioned only in memoirs or second-hand letters. Scholars still debate whether the Church sanctioned such practices directly or merely turned a blind eye to local improvisation. One widely known, though possibly exaggerated, device was the heretic's fork, a metal rod with prongs at both ends, strapped between the chest and chin. Any head movement drove the spikes into flesh. Its purpose wasn't injury, it was compliance, to hold the head still, to suppress dissent. And that's what made inquisitorial torture different. It wasn't meant to be loud, or even final. It was methodical, bureaucratic, a quiet violence in candlelit rooms, where monks asked questions in Latin, while a man screamed through bloodied teeth. In a way, these institutions weren't just torturing people, they were torturing meaning, trying to extract certainty from ambiguity, to make faith measurable, confessable, and enforceable. We often remember the Inquisition for its fires, but its real legacy may be this: the blending of theology with process, of divinity with data. In the name of truth, a system was built that turned faith into confession, and confession into control. Tools of silence, gags, masks, and shame devices. Not all torture in the medieval world spilled blood or snapped bones. Some worked on a subtler register, silencing the mouth, branding the face, crushing the spirit. These were the tools that didn't need screams to be effective. In fact, many were designed to prevent them. For every rack or wheel, there was a gag, a mask, a collar, small instruments that operated at the threshold between punishment and humiliation. In towns across 14th and 15th century Europe, these devices were used not just on accused criminals, but on gossips, beggars, blasphemers, and those who challenged social norms. Justice, in this case, was personal and often public. One of the most infamous instruments was the scold's bridle, also known as the branx. This was a metal cage that fit over the head like a grotesque helmet. Inside, a flat iron plate rested against the tongue, or in some versions, pressed it down sharply with a spike. The wearer couldn't speak without injury. It was used primarily on women accused of being too loud, argumentative, or disruptive to the peace, terms that, historians now note, often masked deeper social anxieties about female autonomy. Mainstream legal records from Scotland and Germany in the 16th century confirm multiple instances of the bridle being used not only for punishment but as a kind of public warning. Offenders were paraded through the streets, led on chains, their distorted faces exposed for all to see. And that was the point. This wasn't just about physical discomfort, it was about visibility, about branding a soul through the face. Another common device was the iron collar, less famous than the bridle, but more broadly applied. Fixed with bells or spikes, some were designed to limit movement or force the wearer into a rigid posture. Others had bells attached to shame the person into isolation. In towns, they were chained outside taverns or churches, where offenders would be left for hours, or even days, open to public ridicule. Children threw stones, adults spat, justice by humiliation. And then there were the mask punishments. Iron visages, shaped like pigs, donkeys, or demons, placed over the head and strapped tightly behind. Often reserved for those accused of lying or slander, these masks turned people into caricatures of their supposed sins. In Nuremberg, city records from the late 1400s describe a series of masks used for social mockery, with elongated noses for liars or flared ears for eavesdroppers. The fringe detail here, and one that scholars still debate, is whether some of these devices were ever ritualized by the church. There are scattered references in early monastic records to penance masks made of wood or leather, worn during confessions or public atonements. Were they purely symbolic, or did they reflect a deeper blending of spiritual silence and enforced shame? Unlike other torture tools, these devices didn't seek confession or death. Their cruelty lay in their duration, hours, days. The silence they imposed often lingered long after the device was removed. They worked not by drawing blood, but by turning the offender into an object, a walking warning, a parody of their own crime, and in doing so, they taught obedience not through fear of pain, but through fear of exposure. In the medieval imagination, punishment didn't have to kill to work. Sometimes it only needed to make someone visible, and then leave them alone with what the world had seen. Torture for science, the body as a map of sin. In the twilight between medieval and early modern Europe, a strange transformation took place, one where torture, once reserved for confession or punishment, began to overlap with something more curious, more clinical. The body, long regarded as the vessel of the soul, began to be seen also as a map, one that could be studied, corrected, and even reshaped through pain. Torture met science, or at least what passed for science at the time. By the 15th and 16th centuries, European scholars were blending classical medical theories with Christian ideas of sin. The dominant model was the four humours: blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile, each thought to govern personality and health. Imbalance meant illness, but it could also mean moral failure. Melancholy wasn't just sadness, it was a spiritual affliction. Rage wasn't just temperament, it was excess yellow bile. In this worldview, the body became a kind of diagnostic field, and pain, a way to restore order. Mainstream records from university towns like Bologna and Montpellier show physicians observing prisoners before and after punishment. Notes were taken on pulse, sweat, breathing patterns. Some believed that the moment of agony revealed hidden truths. "The truth of a man," wrote one Spanish court doctor in 1512, "is made visible in his flesh under strain." This wasn't poetry, it was procedure. One infamous example comes from Italy, where a condemned prisoner in Padua was subjected to sequential water torture while a physician took notes on his muscular spasms and eye dilation, The stated goal? To learn how much water the human stomach could hold before death. The deeper motive? Control disguised as curiosity. Even dissection, once forbidden in many Christian territories, began to gain legitimacy in the late Middle Ages. Public autopsies became occasional events in places like Florence and Paris, especially on executed criminals. It was believed that opening a sinful body revealed the marks of sin, blackened organs, twisted hearts, lesions that explained moral failure. One preserved record describes a bishop ordering the dissection of a man hanged for heresy, hoping to find visible proof of his corrupted soul. Fringe thinkers even went further. A handful of 16th century manuscripts describe experimental devices like bloodletting wheels, where veins were opened in sequence to purge the humours through rotational force. Were they ever truly used? Scholars still debate this. Some claim they were symbolic tools, never actually built. Others believe they were improvised, tested once, and abandoned. And then there's the matter of corrective posture devices, metal corsets, limb restraints, and moral chairs designed to fix not just the spine, but the character. Children who fidgeted too much, spoke out of turn, or displayed dangerous enthusiasm were strapped into chairs for hours, sometimes days. The discomfort was justified as therapeutic, like tuning a crooked instrument. All of this speaks to a broader shift in how pain was viewed, not merely as punishment, but as a method. The line between healer and torturer blurred. The same hands that applied leeches might also tighten screws. The same mind that mapped disease might calibrate suffering. Scholars still debate whether these scientific tortures were widespread or fringe. Most likely, they existed on the edges, where faith, curiosity, and cruelty intersected. But their legacy survives. In every later justification of enhanced interrogation for the sake of information, or tough medicine for the sake of reform, we hear echoes of this moment in history when the body became both the subject and the sentence. In medieval Europe, pain wasn't just punishment, it was exploration, and the flesh, the once sacred, became something to be studied, cut, twisted, and reshaped in pursuit of something called truth. Fading echoes, how torture devices became theatre. By the dawn of the 17th century, a strange quiet began to settle over the torture chambers of Europe. Not immediately, and not everywhere, but gradually, unmistakably. The wheels stopped turning, the ropes stayed coiled, the cellars, once alive with groans and muffled screams, fell still. Something was changing, and not just in law, but in imagination. The decline of institutional torture didn't happen because people grew kinder overnight. It happened because the need for spectacle, fear, and confession began to shift. Emerging legal philosophies emphasized evidence over confession. Enlightenment thinkers questioned the morality of forced pain. New technologies and bureaucracies offered quieter, more efficient ways to control populations. And so, the old tools were retired. Mainstream historians often point to places like Sweden and parts of the Holy Roman Empire, where legal reforms in the mid-1600s officially restricted or banned torture in criminal trials. In France, the practice was formally abolished during the Revolution. By the early 19th century, in most of Europe, torture had become illegal, or at least officially invisible. But the devices remained. And that's when a curious transformation took place. They began to perform again, not in dungeons, but in museums. Take the Iron Maiden of Nuremberg, which, as mentioned earlier, was likely assembled in the 1800s from scrap and imagination. It was never used, but it was seen, displayed, photographed, sold to visitors as proof of the medieval mind's brutality. It became a character in its own right. History turned into theatre. Other devices followed suit: spiked chairs, cat's paws, pear gags, stretching racks. They all found second lives behind velvet ropes and glass displays. Some were fakes, Others were real but mislabeled, misused or misunderstood. It didn't matter. They felt real, and that feeling, shock, revulsion, fascination, became the new currency of torture. Fringe collectors in the 19th century began assembling chambers of horrors, especially in cities like London, Vienna, and Paris. These were travelling exhibitions or permanent fixtures in wax museums, where visitors paid to see the grim relics of a crueler age. The message was always the same: look how far we've come. But the subtext was more complex. The devices didn't just warn, they entertained. Scholars still debate whether these displays helped or hindered our understanding of the Middle Ages. On one hand, they preserved physical remnants of a difficult past. On the other, they exaggerated, dramatized, and in many cases, outright invented a vision of medieval cruelty that was bloodier and more bizarre than the truth. Even now, modern audiences are drawn to these objects, not necessarily for their historical significance, but for the chill they bring. Shows, games, books, and films continue to reimagine torture chambers as gothic playgrounds of horror. We say we're learning history, but often we're telling ghost stories. And yet, buried beneath the exaggeration, the real pain remains. Not in the polished spikes or reconstructed wheels, but in the quiet margins of court documents, the trembling handwriting of survivors, the prayers whispered behind cell walls. The tools may be silent now, but the systems they served, the impulse to extract, punish, silence, have not vanished. In many places today, torture still happens, not with wooden racks or iron bridles, but with modern tools, in sterile rooms behind official language. The echo of the medieval chamber, muffled though it may be, still reaches us. So as we walk past these devices in museums or see them on screens, we should remember they were never meant to be remembered. They were built to disappear, to do the earwork in silence. The fact that they survive, however distorted, is both a warning and a reckoning. Conclusion: we often look back at the medieval world as something distant, crude, primitive, alien in its thinking. But in the torture chambers of the Middle Ages, we find something unsettlingly familiar. These weren't the tools of madmen, they were the tools of institutions. Built by engineers, used by officials, justified by law, faith, and science. The devices may seem monstrous, but the minds behind them believed they were restoring order, protecting truth, saving souls. That is what makes them terrifying. We've replaced the wheel with walls, the brank with silence, the rack with systems more discreet. But the logic hasn't always changed. We still struggle with the tension between justice and control, between punishment and spectacle. And even now, the shadow of those chambers lingers, in our courts, in our headlines, in the quiet spaces where fear still whispers louder than law. The medieval torture device wasn't just a product of its time, it was a mirror, one we're still looking into, whether we want to or not.